Brady doesn't give himself enough due. He was the first guy that really gave me a chance to kind of get out and talk to developers at the conferences. Skyhook was like a no-name company. I was a guy just getting there and trying to like take this concept of Wi-Fi position. Now this is like 2005, maybe six. Like you have to remember back then, pre-iPhone, way pre-iPhone. The only phones out there at location were rugged Nextel phones that had a GPS and J2ME on it, and 10 people in the world had those phones. And so Skyhook building out location via Wi-Fi was this kind of crazy concept, and our job was to go out there and explain to people why this was something that mattered. And Brady was awesome in giving us a chance to do that. So it's amazing that location has exploded, where as a conference kind of disappeared. And I think part of it was that location just became part of everything. It was no longer like this own standalone thing. Maybe like this will eventually be someday where it's just like, well, of course they're doing 3D manufacturing. That's just part of the process of lots of companies. And it's not just this new thing that needs its own conferences and all that kind of stuff. So kind of fun to think back through the trajectory. So I don't have everything prepared, but I thought what I would do is maybe just kind of go through the history of some of the stuff I've worked on, and then please feel free to jump in, and we'll hopefully leave a ton of time at the end for just discussion and comments. There's stuff about platform and developers and all that kind of stuff, but I'm also happy to talk about, I joined Twitter at like 30 people, and I'd worked in small companies before that. I stayed until about 2,200 at Twitter. And so as you're thinking through just like building companies and teams, if you ever have questions on that kind of stuff too, I'm happy to talk about it. So I'll rewind a little bit probably to the Skyhook era, because it probably leads into some of this stuff. So Skyhook was doing Wi-Fi positioning. Remember war driving as a concept? Skyhook did that commercially. We paid 500 drivers around the world to take this device, which was an iPack and a off-the-shelf Bluetooth dongle. We paid some guys in Russia to write software that captured Wi-Fi and GPS signals. And then we gave people like a Pac-Man map and told them to go drive up and down. We would get those signals back at HQ every night. And one of the lessons I think I learned from that experience, it was the first kind of like pro company I had worked at. I was a self-taught programmer, college dropout, bounced around to startups. So I hadn't come from like a venture-backed world and gone to Stanford and entered into that world. This was like a hacker's way of finding their way through the ecosystem. And I think one of the biggest lessons I learned at Skyhook, which was really interesting as someone thinking through a business, is Wi-Fi positioning and that concept had been proven out in academia. And they're like, yeah, you can take known access points and you can kind of walk around and figure out where those things are. And you can then do GPS-like location, which was really kind of cool back then. Still is cool, but very cool back then. But everyone thought it would be super expensive to do on a city level. And the founder of the company was just like, he just left his job at an enterprise company. He's like, screw it. How much can this cost? How about this? I'll pay some guys in Russia to write the software. I'll get off-the-shelf parts. And I'll pay someone to drive Boston. That was where we were based. And he found out it cost like $25,000. Everyone else thought it would cost hundreds of thousands or millions, and he made a hypothesis he could get it done for really cheap. And he's like, okay, how many cities matter? Where's the density? How much can I license this for? And he was just one of the guys that went through and kind of brute force it, put a bunch of it on credit cards and figured it out. And for me, that was one of those things of like, you can talk yourself out of stuff a lot of times ahead of time just by telling or having other people tell you that it was hard or impossible or they didn't try it. And sometimes it's just worth taking that test and like really pushing in the market to see if there's something there. So we ended up building a company. We got a call, we were probably about 10, 12 employees at the time, and we got a voicemail from Steve Jobs one day saying, hey, Ted, this is Steve Jobs from Apple. We'd love to catch up sometime. And Ted played it for the office, and he's like, ha ha, like, right, guys, like, why, like, yeah, it would maybe make sense that Apple would call. We could kind of get that part of it. But why would Steve Jobs be the one calling? It was really weird. Turned out it was him. Called back, and he and our CEO for like 3 or 4 months negotiated the deal. And I flew out to Cupertino with our CTO at the time, and we had to like furiously, within the span of 2 weeks, get our software to work on their devices where they like leave you in a cubicle, and they only let you leave the cubicle when you need to go to the bathroom, and they walk you to the bathroom, they wait for you, and they walk you back. This was like Gen 1 iPhones. And it was a just totally exhausting, crazy, take years off your life experience. I'll never forget we've been working really hard to get this stuff working on the drivers and their chipsets. And everything we kept doing was like the chipset was caching access points for a really long time, which when you're trying to do positioning is terrible. And we couldn't get them to change it very well. They think they would, and it wasn't working. I'd go out and test them, and it was not going. The location was way off. We knew it could be better. And suddenly it was like down to the final days, and they're like, okay, we're gonna take the phones out and just drive out in different places and come back and test the data. We're just like, shit, this is not gonna be good. Take the phones out, they go off out in the world, they come back an hour later, and they're kind of setting them up in the office or in this cubicle we're in. And we had seen them type in the root password into the devices at one point, and we're like jacking into the phones, trying to like quickly pull the data off and do our own analysis. Our CTO Nick writes this really quick script to turn all of that data into like GPX tracks to run in Google Earth. And he loads up the GPX tracks, and it's just this like smattering of dots all over the place, and expecting like these kind of clean lines for where people have driven, and like literally I was sick to my stomach. We are just our whole company is riding on this thing, and we had spent 2 weeks and couldn't make it work, and now they were going to ship these devices without us. And the guy comes in, takes their devices away, and he goes and does kind of the same thing, I guess. I don't know. They probably have better tools. Comes back in, and he's like, "Well, looks great," and we're like, okay, like maybe we don't know what's going on. Long story short, Nick had transposed 2 numbers in his script to do the GPS trails, so he fixed those really quickly, and suddenly there were these like nice clean lines all over the Bay Area. So yeah, it was a fun experience, but that really catapulted Skyhook kind of onto this, at least in our small world of like developers and kind of people in the tech space. Put us on the map. We started doing more conferences, and our job then was to get into the manufacturers, Samsung, HTC, Motorola at the time. It's now all changed. And my job was to get it onto everything except phones, because we had guys who were going after what we call like elephant hunting. You have a few accounts that matter, and those things are going to be worth millions of dollars, but it's year-long, 2-year-long sales cycles, and you may never get them. And so I started thinking, okay, well, we need to get it onto laptops, because that's where Wi-Fi is. People aren't building that much like desktop software, but the web is huge. So why don't we try and think through like how would we get it from the chipset to websites? And so I started working on essentially a DOM standard for getting location in browsers to be accessible via the web. Started reaching out to friends at Firefox and kind of W3C guys in general, and we got a basic standard put together. In the span of 9 months, it was suddenly a W3C standard, and it was baked into Chrome and mobile Safari and Firefox, I think, right away. And it was like just this. When you think of W3C, you think of these long, crazy cycles, and HTML5 has taken forever. And at one point, it almost got rolled up in HTML5, and we fought really hard to make sure it stayed independent. And I'm glad we did, because that meant it got rolled in really quickly. So anytime you see the kind of buttons that pop up and say this browser wants your location, it was that standard. And then that suddenly unlocked, okay, now every website can go take advantage of this stuff. Now it's like, let's go get all these guys signed up to be thinking about locations. Like, okay, how do we build up an ecosystem of people that have just never thought of this, right? They've thought of IP before, but they've never thought of what accurate location could mean for a website. And we didn't have mobile phones that had it everywhere, so it was about how do we go build that ecosystem. And part of it was, working with guys like Brady at Ware to get the just kind of basic evangelism out there. We tried to create basic standards for how this would work. So we knew if we documented it well and developers just found it useful, they would start to use it. And then I also made probably 100 to 150 phone calls and emails per week. I just had a list of people that I thought would care about this stuff at different companies, and I would hunt through who the right person would be, and you just brute force sales. You're not really selling anything, you're just evangelizing, getting this out there. And when you're trying to create a new technology in a new market and build people up, build those ecosystems up, it takes a lot of brute force. And I think it's sometimes lost in the Valley. We build these beautiful systems, and we have great engineers and beautiful design. We got to remember, the websites people use are like eBay, Craigslist, Yahoo. They're not beautifully designed. They aren't like pixel perfect, gorgeous things. They're these sites that have great utility, and they have broad reach. And our job isn't necessarily. I think sometimes we get wrapped around the pole a little bit around making everything look so beautiful instead of just making it really useful. Figuring out what that need and the motivation is in someone's life that you want to deliver value to. So making sure that we found that thing, built great technology, and then got it out there to everyone was the goal. And in the end, Skyhook was kind of an interesting story. I left 2009, right when it felt like Skyhook was going to be taking off. We'd signed the Apple deal. Unfortunately, Google came in with Android and we considered and tested to be fairly inferior Wi-Fi positioning stuff, but they're giving it away for free and strong-arming all of the accounts they had. And it's kind of a crazy case study. I think it's actually at Harvard's business school. Skyhook came in, patented everything, created the whole market. Android came in with a free thing and had relationships with all the carriers and literally told them that they would invalidate all of their devices if they use Skyhook instead of Google stuff. So Skyhook's embattled in a long, big lawsuit with Google still over that stuff. So yeah, it's just it's an interesting thing to be thinking about when you look at the history of how technology works. Is you can build great stuff, you can put the patents in place, you can do all this, but when the right market forces come into play, it's very hard to fight them. Even though Skyhook had the patents and they're suing them for it, Google has a lot more money and time. So use that to then go over to Twitter. And really the way I got the job there is evangelizing what we were supposed to do. I was putting together designs all the time, like page by page. I used to be a designer, pixel by pixel, like, hey, here's what location could look like within Twitter. And I got to know the guys, and I'd send them these decks all the time. And they're like, it's awesome, we would love to do this. Kind of around when John was there. I met them when they were probably like 10, 12 guys. Like, we'd love to do this, but our servers are burning to the ground every single day, and like we're putting every resource we have to just keeping this thing online, and we still can't do it, so we can't really think about new features. And so I spent like a year and a half just kind of like staying in touch with them and talking to a bunch of other groups. But eventually probably would have been like early 2009, they were like, why don't you just come work here? We just launched this API, we don't really know what to do with it, we just kind of pushed it out there in the world, and we should really figure out what we should do with this thing. And I'd just gotten my then fiance to move from San Francisco to Boston with me because I couldn't leave Skyhook. We were buying a condo, and it was a DM from Alex Payne, who's the original engineer on it, and I almost just like deleted it or said no because I was like, my wife would kill me if I just made her move across the country and then told her to move all the way back. But we discussed it, and we both wanted to be in San Francisco, and this is a good opportunity, obviously. So. Decided to take the role and moved out to San Francisco to be PM on the API. It's funny because there's a quote from Eric Schmidt about like, if someone asks you to get on a rocket ship, don't ask which seat. And I think it's such a good quote because when you see these companies that are just sometimes, there's just something there, you don't know what it is, it's attaching in people's minds and it's growing like crazy. And I talked to friends who are thinking about joining them like, well, it's just a PM role instead of a director role, and they're fighting for like, certain number of shares and like certain salary, and I'm like, go in there, prove value, figure it out, and over time, if you're there early, that's all that matters. Like, don't fight over this and lose out on the opportunity just because you like couldn't get to $20,000 worth of salary, like some difference in compensation. So it was a great time to join Twitter because I felt like the opportunity and the upside was incredibly high because it was a 30-person company and you were joining early. But it was pretty clear it was headed somewhere. You didn't know necessarily where it was going to go, but you knew it was headed somewhere, and it was going to be a fun journey. Kind of no matter what. So I joined on to PM the API, and really what had happened, if you guys know the history of the API there, Twitter was built in Rails, and there was like a single config option. You can be like, add API, and deploy it, and suddenly there's a kind of RESTful XML-ish API that people can start to play with. And the deepest of thought at the time was like, well, we have a few engineers who are offshore, and someone wanted to build a desktop widget, so like, yeah, that'll be cool, like let them go do that. So Alex turned it on, created like a Google group at the time and like a wiki, and that was the launch of the API. And so there wasn't a lot of forethought as to like why or how, and it was just like taking the same system that like built Twitter, right, or that was Twitter, and just making it available via RESTful resources. And so it wasn't thought of like, okay, well here's the strategy of how we want people to use the API or what we want them to build. It was like, the easiest thing for you to build is clearly Twitter, because that's what the APIs do on the other end, is they support Twitter as a product. So my charter when I came in was to kind of figure out like, well, what should we do with this thing? Is this going to be something worthwhile? I think we kind of knew in 3 months that there was just enough demand in it. And really the strategy we had at the time, which is maybe kind of sad to look at now, is that we were so underwater with getting everything else going that we knew we couldn't build out all these other ways in which we thought Twitter could be interesting in the world. And at the time, we thought more of Twitter as kind of a protocol, right? It was more like email in ways than it was like the client. There was a website and there was SMS, but there was no mobile. TweetDeck, and I think TweetDeck existed at the time. There were a few like desktop widgets, a few like mobile clients, kind of. Still super early in that like ecosystem. And so we looked at it as like, man, this is outsourced product development. This is great. Like, we don't have to pay for that. These guys build all these like unique experiences, and we get to have people engage in Twitter and mobile in a world that we couldn't do that in any time soon. And so it was this like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Twitter will be at the bottom of all that or underneath all of that. And all these are myriad of ways that people will connect with Twitter can be thought of by a bunch of different developers out in the world. But it was about building kind of core Twitter experiences for the most part. You also had kind of a contingent of people building experiences for focused audiences, and that was a really interesting one. So CoTweet was one of the kind of first developers in the ecosystem, and their point of view was if you are, and it was born out of them being, I think they were a marketing agency before, if you even worked in a marketing agency, where like 5 or 6 people were trying to manage the Twitter account for them. and they're like, well, I would have replied to this person, but I didn't know you were supposed to, and actually Brady is the right person to do it, so let me assign Brady that task or whatever. There was like a workflow that needed to exist on top of Twitter that Twitter.com did never support. And all these like kind of new brands and small businesses and small teams were starting to use Twitter in that way, and we had no tools for them. So CoTweet came and filled that space. TweetDeck was kind of one of those. And we saw this like whole ecosystem starting to crop up there, which is like these focused audiences of people need to engage in Twitter in a certain way, but the audiences aren't big enough yet, especially as a team of like 30 or 50 people, to go build them custom-built stuff. And that was where I think if you look back at it, that's probably the best place for the ecosystem to exist. And those thrived really well. CoTweet got acquired. Analytics were kind of another point of view, like brands and marketers needed analytics on top of it. But again, we were just trying to add like retweet as a feature because that didn't exist yet. And we were trying to add like, clicking on a hashtag and making that a search because that didn't exist yet. And so that we were focused on the core audience, and the ecosystem allowed us to kind of have this release valve that allowed the ecosystem to go build these products for these focused audience that were a big enough business for them, but not a big enough business for us, or it would be a distraction for us to go do it. And so we spent probably my first year focused on that type of ecosystem, kind of 1,000 flowers bloom, let a bunch of people go. And our job, actually I used to have a dashboard internally that showed the percent of tweets coming in from third parties versus first party clients. And it was like trending towards the third party client ecosystem being larger than Twitter. It was like 60-40 at one point. I used to joke that my job was to put Twitter.com out of business. And that was like literally the theory we had at the time. How wrong I was a few months later. But I think, how many of you guys follow the like Twitter stuff at the time, around the Twitter stuff? Okay, so I'll give a little bit of that history. So Twitter was Twitter.com and SMS. There was no mobile client. This was all done by third parties. And we had this like pretty vibrant ecosystem. We got to know all the guys. They were essentially part of Twitter. They, Tweety, TweetDeck, Twitter, they all sound like Twitter. Brizzly, God, what else was out there? Seismic, there were a bunch of them out there, probably like 10 that mattered. What was the BlackBerry one? Do you remember? Uber Twitter.
Oh yeah.
Uber Twitter was big, yeah. Because there was another one, right? Twitter was never going to build something for BlackBerry at the time, and there was a huge audience of people there that wanted to use it. So we started seeing mobile broadly taking off like crazy, right? iOS had launched at this point, or Apple launched at this point, or sorry, iPhone had launched and eventually iOS launched. And we saw this thing just growing like crazy. And we would look at our own numbers on mobile and it just wasn't growing at the same pace. And we're like, why is this? What's going on? So we spent some time and started to dig in with user research. Went on to Craigslist and we hired people off Craigslist who were like, you've heard of Twitter, you're interested in it, but you haven't signed up for it yet. Come in and talk to us. And we had this kind of video, famous video for us at least, that we played at our developer conference that explained kind of how this process was. And we sat this girl down, we gave her an iPhone and we said, find Twitter, you've heard about it, find it and sign up for it. And she goes into the App Store, she searches for Twitter, and there's like, 10 bird-looking like icons and a bunch of things that start with TW, but like none of them say Twitter. And she like sets the phone back down and hands it back to the like researcher, and we're like, oh shit, this is happening millions of times over right now, because that's the way that people are connecting now, right? They're on iOS, they're on Android, they're on BlackBerry, they're searching for things, and they're not finding Twitter, but they're finding Facebook, and they're finding all these other platforms, they're not finding us. And so we had to have some really kind of deep soul searching at that moment and be like, who are we? What is our business? What do we do in this world? And our view of it was we needed to have a first-party application that people could connect with if we were going to be the experience and not just the protocol. And if we think back through it, there's very few businesses in life, and I don't know if we ever came up with a great example of just protocol layer businesses that became real big businesses, right? Like SMTP is widely used, and there are big businesses built around it with Exchange and Gmail and some of those now. But SMTP as the protocol owner didn't succeed as a company, right? So you could then decide, okay, well, we're going to build like Twitter infrastructure. We'll build, almost like XMPP or whatever the would have kind of core layer would have been. We could build clients and build an exchange-like business, but that didn't feel like the opportunity we wanted to go after. We had an opportunity to kind of be the whole stack. And so we looked at it and said, okay, it's important that we own the client and the user experience. Doesn't mean we have to be the only way people engage with it, but we need to have a primary experience for everyone out there so the new people that are coming onto the platform have something to connect with, and we grow that whole audience. And as you think about platforms, this was like one of those really fundamental things that that I learned through, and I fought it for a long time because my job was to like go build up this ecosystem and become friends with them, and you hear about the business they're creating. They were building great products, they cared about it, and now suddenly we were gonna like pull the rug out from underneath a few of them. And so it was a tough time to go through and talk to and decide, but in the end it was the right choice to do overall for Twitter and I think for the ecosystem. And when I look back at it, I think the biggest lesson learned is that your job as an ecosystem owner is to build and create the biggest pie for everybody, build the most opportunity you can. And if we went from 10 million users to 100 million users, that meant that now suddenly every other company in the ecosystem had another 90 million users to try and create value for, right? So all the analytics companies suddenly would have a bigger audience because the brands cared more because there were more users there. If you were CoTweet, there's more JetBlues and Starbucks of the world to be customers for you because there's more people on the platform. And so our job was to always optimize the overall pie, not always trying to optimize it for each slice. Now, of course, it sucks if you're one of the companies that's affected by it and you feel like you've had the rules changed on you. But unfortunately, it's one of the things you have to manage. And I look back at that part too, and I'm like, well, if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm looking around, I'm looking at all the different choices I have to make, and there's risks everywhere, right? Do I build iOS or do I build Android? Do I build HTML5 or do I build native? Do I, all of these different things, and you're assessing the pros and cons, the risk reward of each of those. And one of them is to build on Twitter or build on Facebook or build on iOS. And well, what are the benefits of that? Well, Twitter pays for all of your infrastructure. Twitter brings, now 250,000,000 users to bear for you. There's brand awareness. There's all this stuff that comes for you for free. And now the risk is that the platform strategy might change. You might be affected by it. And so I think that's the right way to be framing it in your own mind as you think about how to do this stuff. And it's great to be upfront with people. I think being as transparent and predictable in your actions as possible is probably one of the most important things, because ecosystems and all of those calculations are built on kind of trust, right? Of I want to know that this actor is going to act in a trustworthy way over time so that I can kind of predict how they're going to operate, and therefore I can try and build my business with the most clarity and the most transparency possible.
So I know it wasn't your thing.
Yeah.
But obviously, eventually the Twitter story changed, and there was a kind of U-turn. And so that the predictability and the transparency just went away.
I would say the predictability changed. Right? I don't think we were as transparent as we could be about why it happened. We were as transparent as we could be about what we know. So actually one of the other kind of interesting parts is you'll get asked as you build a platform well, give us your roadmap. Tell us what you're going to build, so then we don't build it. This is so obvious and easy. Let's just do this, guys. And you're like, I don't know about you, but as a startup, we didn't know week to week what we were going to build. And we had tons of projects that almost got to launch after months of work that got killed at the last minute to never ship again. And so we were in the state of we didn't actually know exactly what was going to happen. We didn't have perfect information, and to share imperfect information is almost more damaging than not doing it. So I think it definitely changed, right? We were much more predictable up front. We became less predictable at that point, and we did a few other things along the way that made it less predictable. In the end, I look back at that, and the first change we made was okay, well, we're going to build our own clients. We acquired kind of the best one. We rebranded it Twitter, and we launched it out there as Twitter, but we let all the other guys continue to operate. If we had known that we were going to end up in the world that we did, which is essentially okay, the rest of the clients kind of go away, please. This is now distracting, it's expensive, it goes against our business, that you're taking users away from our core business, and became more friction than complementary. If we'd known that that's where we were going to end up, we should have just made that leap. Instead, we made 3 different cuts along the way of okay, well, now we don't really want new clients, so we stopped any new clients showing up. And they're okay, well, we don't want the existing clients to grow, so we're going to cap them. And so each time along the way, you're taking the hit and that kind of predictability burden of that, or the kind of transparency burden of it. They just look at you and they're like, well, what's next? Who's next? Who are you going to kill in this ecosystem next? So I think it changed over time. I don't think it's binary and it goes from 1 to 0. It's a gradient. But we for sure lost some of it. I think we lost a lot of developers along the way. But yeah. Yeah, they're complex ecosystems, right? It's the way I describe it to the team. It's like being the mayor of a town. You're never going to meet all the constituents there, and all you get are the ability to make rules at the top of this funnel that try and create the create the right incentives and disincentives to produce the behavior you want downstream. And sometimes you can write a policy the wrong way that actually either totally kills off great behavior that you think is good but didn't seem obvious at the time, or has unintended consequences around what you wrote. And so your job is to try and write the most exacting policy you can to try and affect the right behavior downstream with the information you have at the time, but it's always imperfect, and you got to constantly tweak it over time. So that was definitely a big change for us, though, at the time. In the end, looking back at it, I for sure think that it was the right thing for the company to do. And maybe the tough part for all of those guys to hear as they went through it, I don't think Twitter would have could have done it or should have done it any other way, unfortunately. And I don't mean arriving at that decision early on. Like, Twitter wouldn't be what it is today if all of those clients didn't exist for those first 2 or 3 years. I mean, they helped Twitter get out of like a time that they should have never survived, because no one should be down that often. No one shouldn't have a mobile device or a desktop client or whatever, mobile client or a desktop client. And so they actually helped Twitter get out of that space and grow, and then they lost their business over time. Now, if you go talk to those developers, this is the kind of funny part too, is you get a lot of peanut gallery, right, when you become kind of a platform that much people watch. And so you get everyone chirping from the outside and watching from the outside, like, how dare you do that to Brady? That's so crazy, poor Brady. And I'd call Brady up saying he's an iPhone developer. He's like, dude, I'm not mad. I just bought myself a Tesla. These guys had made like a few $1 million as independent developers in like New Mexico and Pennsylvania. So they were like happy as can be. Obviously they would have loved it to like keep growing, but they're like, I made millions of dollars on this. This is awesome. But it was all the people watching and trying to like assess. Some people just like to be commentary. But the other kind of real part of it that you had to pay attention to is that the other developers who were building business on it watching, they're like, okay, well, how'd you treat him? Because that could be me soon, and could I see myself in his shoes? And so you have this like chilling effect if you don't handle it well, if you don't operate in a certain way that can really kind of put a big chill on the rest of the ecosystem. So yeah, it was interesting times. Do you have questions on that part of it, or like those decisions or stuff? It's funny, it feels so long ago now, and actually maybe it is, I guess it's probably 4 years ago, but still so fresh.
If they want to incent developers to
yes.
build applications against their hardware, what are some basic thoughts for how they should structure that?
Yeah, great question. That's the crux of all this, huh?
Or even first step.
Yeah.
Well, it might be something that runs against the hardware. It might be something that runs against the data.
The data that comes out of it. In the end, I looked at generally the long-term motivations for developers are always the same. It's like fame and fortune, right? Like anyone else. They're trying to build independent businesses that allow them to continue to do the stuff that they're passionate about. And the only way that you can help them really do that over time is to send them money, right? It doesn't have to always be in the form of money. It can be users that they then monetize on their own. But in the end, you want to give them independence to build a business. So it doesn't mean you have to start that way right away, but in the long run, you have to know that that's where you're going to get. If you're Facebook or you're Twitter or you're Apple or you're whoever, that's the end game. And so now there's going to be phases along the way to get there. Twitter in the early days was just such a unique and interesting data set that no one else had access to, that it just hadn't existed before. That alone drew people in just out of their curiosity and interest to play with this thing. You could suddenly call an API and I could buzz Brady's phone, right? That was a really unique thing back then. And then we also had the concept of this whole corpus of content that you could search and analyze that was kind of it was like a global consciousness that you could see. That you could suddenly tap into, right? How are people in the UK feeling right now? That was something someone wrote a screensaver that said I feel, I love, I think, I hate, and they were just searching Twitter for those things and it would randomly rotate through, and it was just that wasn't possible anywhere in the world. So there was that kind of early phase where people are just going to want access to things that are unique and interesting. And I think as you think in the hardware space, it's what are new mechanics, what are new behaviors, what are new experiences that you're allowing them to tap into that didn't exist before, right? 3D printing broadly, right? Suddenly a developer could write something and it would physically appear. That wasn't possible before. You didn't have to give them money to go do it. They just wanted to make that thing happen. But now at some point they're okay, well that's just cool. I quit my job and I want to keep doing this, so how am I going to start to do this? And they gravitate towards the platforms that help them become successful. So I think when you get into the real depth of how we try to do it, so one was just build something that people want to use. You see a lot of people creating APIs just because they think oh, if I build an API, of course an ecosystem will show up and people will want to use it. APIs have a very big cost to them, so it's very important that you think through why you're going to do it and what part of your business it's going to drive and how it's going to drive that, and really think that through as much as you can. It doesn't mean don't do it if you can't figure it out, because again, Twitter, if they thought that through too much of the time, probably wouldn't have done it. And so sometimes you get this just kind of you luck into it a little bit, but and sometimes you want that kind of what we used to call emergent behavior, where you can't pre-plan exactly what someone's going to do, but you at least want them to play in the sandbox that you know they're going to play in, instead of just like running all over the business and be like, oh, wait, that was the part of the business that I thought we were going to own, and suddenly there's someone there, and now we either have to displace them or we have to compete with them, and that's not fun either. So really be thinking through like what the goals are for you and what it's going to try and build into your business. And if you want them to explore and create and experiment, give them kind of a sandbox to do it in where it doesn't affect your business. So if you think of Apple, I still look at Apple as kind of the ultimate ecosystem, the ultimate platform, because they created this like perfect sandbox. The monetization was so closely attached to it that like it was accretive to their platform. Like they got value every time someone built an app for it, because it sold more phones for them, which was already part of their business model. Then they actually charged for apps, and they took a 30% vig on all of that. Now they have in-app purchases and all this stuff. The developer got a cut because suddenly they're bringing them, like, I don't know, how many iOS devices out there in the world now, 300 million or something, 400 million? They're bringing them 400 million users in an app store that's gonna promote them, and there's suddenly money there, right? So that one's it's a really well-oiled platform. So be thinking through what the motivations are, give them access to things that they don't have anywhere else. Because if you think about like, if you're trying to go compete against other people in the market, and that API is already available somewhere else with bigger scale on a more mature platform, it's going to be very hard to try and get people to be thinking about why to develop for you and not someone else. Make it super simple. Back in the day, if you wanted to like partner with someone, you'd fill out the form, and the sales guy would call you and be like, how much money do you have? And they're like, well, I don't know. And it was like negotiation to even play with the data. What made Twitter so magical is it was documented. You could go into terminal and just make a really quick request over the simple APIs, and you get these like data structures back that were readable and easy. It wasn't SOAP, it wasn't these like big complex envelopes, it was just super simple readable stuff. And so it was really easy for developers to start just like throwing it into their applications, not even thinking about it. They didn't have to call us and ask us for permission. They created, actually back then they even created a token, they just used their username and password, which was really bad, but now fixed. But it was reducing all of the friction to getting people into it. If you look at more modern day ones, like Stripe is a company that I admire a lot in the ecosystem space. God, think about what payments were like back then. You used to have to create all of your own like accounts and call people up to get access to their program that they would maybe bless you for because they had costs, and Stripe was just like, have at it. Let's get to scale, make this as easy as possible, and reduce the friction from interest in the platform to like getting value out of the platform. And then once it's in those places, then you start to build your business model around it, but the hooks have already been set in. So document it, make it super easy. I think one of the decisions we made pretty early on, which I think was a great one, was one of the few good ones we made, was that I knew the developer site was going to need to, so at the time we were a total Rails shop. We didn't have anything else. And if you wanted to launch anything, it had to be in Rails. And so if you go to build a developer site, what do you need for a developer site? You need like documentation, forums, ticketing, sign up to like get a token, all that kind of stuff. We had to like custom build all of that stuff in Rails, and I'm like, this isn't really additive to our business. We're just building forums. Like, how's that helping Twitter out? And so I fought really hard to use Drupal internally because it was a mature system. It had all the things we needed. We could tweak it and still do what we wanted to do out of it. We could hook it up into our systems, but we weren't spending months building forums, which are well-trodden path already out in a different platform. So John actually was part of that review to get PHP and MySQL into the system. Was a totally, actually, yeah, I think MySQL already in, but PHP and was a totally new thing, but it was worth fighting for, because in the end, most of what you're going to do from a developer point of view or a developer evangelist point of view is create content that scales, right? You can't work one-on-one with every single developer over time, or that means you're going to have one developer evangelist for every partner you're ever going to have, right? So you need to find what we call high leverage ways of learning something, creating a unique piece of knowledge around your platform, and then getting that out to everyone possible. Content management, from just basic page documentation to blogging to forums, were really kind of high leverage ways for us to support the community without having to touch every single kind of transaction along the way. I'm trying to think of other motivations. We never got around to Twitter still hasn't like syndicated revenue in any way, right? So Twitter doesn't like make it super easy to extract revenue out of the platform. And in fact, in its early days, if you were co-tweet, we didn't really help you in any way. You had to like go get your own SEO going, and people find you through Google, or you have to build your own sales force. Twitter didn't do any of that for you. And I think when you look at the healthy ecosystems like Apple, they create these ways to connect users and the developers. And the more friction you can remove out of that part of the system, the more efficient you can make the marketplace, the more valuable it is for users because they're connecting with great apps and getting more value out of your platform. And for the app developers, it's great because now that is now taken off their plate, and you can just be one guy in Pennsylvania and not need a sales force to go get distribution for your application. I'm trying to think what else in that space. I think some of the stuff we did wrong early on, or maybe took too long to switch, is we tried to, and that same kind of concept of like let 1,000 flowers bloom and support this big ecosystem. We had, I think when I left, we had like 4 or 5 million unique user tokens in the system. And that didn't include all the sites. I think there were 4 or 5 million websites using like tweet buttons and follow buttons. So it's this massive ecosystem, people using it in tons of ways. It doesn't mean 4 or 5 million unique developers, but probably over 1 million or 2, be my guess. And I think we spent way too much time in the long tail of that stuff, supporting everyone at the bottom. So we'd have a few guys who were just, everyone in our team were ex-developers, right? They were ex-engineers. And so they kind of gravitate towards the indie developers and they wanted to support them. And so they'd be helping a guy debug his OAuth call because he's writing a script for his like, college thing. And it's like, fundamentally, as an engineer to engineer, you appreciate that. But when you're trying to figure out a team and how to build value at large scale, that's just not going to make an impact in any meaningful way on the overall business. And so you got to find ways to let them help themselves or let the community help themselves, and then apply kind of the high touch, high value stuff to kind of the torso and up. And at the opposite of that spectrum, I also don't think it's worthwhile spending all of your time with the Samsungs of the world or the Microsofts, whoever you think have the biggest scale, because they're also the least likely to adapt and innovate and try new things. And so your job, I used to describe to our guys, is like, think of yourselves like a venture capitalist. You have your time and your effort, your resources, or the capital you're going to spend. Invest that with the companies you think will make the most eventual impact for our users. And that generally was going to be somewhere maybe the 2nd, 3rd, 4th place in a category, because they were going to be the most hungry. They have enough scale for it to matter. They're going to move quickly, and they're really hungry to do something and move ahead and challenge the rest of the guys. The guys in the 1st or 2nd spot are usually kind of fat cats sitting around who are going to take forever, and it takes a committee to approve it. And then when they finally launch it, it's just not going to be that interesting. So you got to kind of sift through in the market where the right person to spend your time is. If you find that right thing, really go after it. Another thing we did towards the end, took way too long for us to get there, but was hugely, hugely valuable, was creating a certified program for our developers. So in the beginning, it was like, oh, all of our developers are equal. We love all of our children equally, like. And our poor partners, I'm like, say if you're the New York Times, you're getting like 20 phone calls a week, like, hey, I can help you with your Twitter stuff, like let us just put some 3 lines of JavaScript on your site and we'll fix all of your social things, right? And they're getting that like 1 million times over. And so they're like, who do we talk to? Which are the right companies? And so we created a program internally. We hired like a perfect guy who was an analyst at Forrester. He was just like, this is how his brain worked, and you need someone like that. How to like segment the market, who the different types of ecosystem guys are, what's the high bar that they need to achieve in order for us to like promote them and bring them better services. And then from the outside, if you're New York Times, we suddenly have a small subset of like, these are the great partners. These guys have hit a really high bar in terms of product. They're not going anywhere in the next few years. They're not going to go out of business next month. They operate really well. They're not going to share your data in ways that you don't trust them for. They have other customers. Like, it was just this great kind of matchmaking service that then made a few of our partners super successful, or our developers really successful, and made our partners happier because suddenly they could more easily connect in and get value out of the ecosystem. And so that was one that we took way too long to do. We talked about it forever. We're like, oh, we'll build it as an app store and we'll build this great directory of things. And it would have taken so many more resources and still not really have gotten us to the place that like would have gotten us that same value. And instead of just hiring one person and brute forcing it, and like we put up a few pages on the developer site that listed those companies, and like we were done and we got way more value out of it. So again, it kind of goes back to that same thing. I think in the Valley we think through these like elegant technical solutions a lot of times, and really a lot of this stuff is just human brute force work that can be maybe less pretty as a system design, but just gets the work done and can be more cost effective too. I could have joined any other platform, and I wouldn't have taken it to the same, I wouldn't have taken it to the levels that Twitter was. I don't think it had a lot to do with me. I probably tried to stay out of the way of it more than like try and help it. It was just a thing that was going to grow no matter what, because there was so much interest there. Our job was to try and like put the pieces together as best you can and like try and keep pointing it in the right direction and just like get out of the way. So there wasn't really anything we had to do that part of it. I think we looked over time. So there were some examples, less around kind of growth hacking and just building better platform products. So back in the day, if you were a website and you wanted to have your users send a tweet, like you had to have them OAuth and like do this crazy dance to get a URL, or they had to like copy the URL out of your browser, go over to Twitter, type it in, or like post it into the tweet box and then like send it out. And we're like, that's weird, that's kind of crazy. Why don't we just build a product that like makes that super easy? So we built a tweet button that they just drop on their page with one line of code. They click it, the thing shows up, and content goes away. So I think it was more around like maybe product hacking and thinking through what the roadmap looked like to just keep reducing friction in every possible place we could, but probably nothing that was at that level. Yeah.
Yeah. So with your API development community, do you have developers, some which might be looking more at the actual structure or foundation of Twitter and contributing there versus those who are using it for content, trying to bring into their products? And if you do, how do you segment that? How do you structure that and manage that?
Yeah, so we definitely had myriad of uses and crazy. And honestly, we tried to categorize it a bunch of times, and you like maybe categorize 70% of it, but then the tail is so long that there's just so many different unique use cases that you kind of don't worry about them. But I think it is very valuable to try and catalog the major kind of buckets of ways in which people are using the platform, because once you know who those users are, the same way if you think about your users on the other end, right? Your job is to know who they are, know what their needs and motivations are, and then build the products that drive those motivations and help deliver value to them. And you got to do the same thing with your kind of development partners. So it's very important to know who those are and do your own analysis of it. There's no real secret to it, I think. It's just talking to people, being in the community, learning from them, but then thinking kind of a structured way of who they are. And then actually we used to sit there and list out like motivations and needs. Like, what do these guys want out of it? So the analytics guys just want more data. They want more metadata around each tweet. They want more structure, and they want more volume of stuff. Say it again?
They're under the hood.
Yeah, they're under the hood. They just want lower level access because they're going to do a bunch of work to then produce a user experience. Whereas if you are New York Times, you want to like just be able to say like, ooh, that's a good tweet that I want to put in my story, and I want to render that in my story without having to do much work. So then we built products for them that solve that need as well. So I think it's the same thing as you think about your customers. They're just another side of it. The book I recommend for anyone thinking about this is one called Invisible Engines. It's a MIT ebook. It's the best articulation I've ever heard of platforms and software platforms. And it really talks about them as two-sided businesses, and the job is to connect these two sides of a business. You're the platform, and they go into there's software platforms that we all know, from Microsoft back in the day to gaming platforms like Xbox, Twitter, Facebook, iOS, Android, all this stuff, right? But there's also other two-sided businesses. There are nightclubs, right? The job of at least a straight nightclub is to get guys to meet girls, and well, the girls aren't going to come, so why don't we lower the rate for them to get in, because that lures more girls and that brings in more guys. And they talk about kind of the dynamics and economics of how platforms work. And you need to think through what your platform is. And you can see these different models. So another strategy was like on the Xbox side, they knew that content was going to be king, right? So they licensed and owned Halo and was only available on Xbox because they knew that would draw in users. And so you have to think about different strategies sometimes around how do you create this like this equilibrium in the two-sided business, and what are the right strategies for trying to make sure those two sides of the business kind of build up equally. Uber was another interesting one. It's a two-sided business, drivers and riders. And they knew that as a rider, if you open up the app the first time and there's no cars there, you're going to like uninstall it or you'll never open it again. So they took their entire first year and they paid drivers out of their pocket to be sitting around there, driving around on empty cars, and they're taking a huge loss on it. So that as those first users came online, there was a car there, waiting for them 5 minutes from anywhere they were, or 10 minutes at the time maybe. And so it was a huge cost burden to them, but they knew that was the right way to get the flywheel going. And so now once enough users showed up, they could stop paying these guys ahead of time, and then they just insert them into the system as, the rider pays the driver, they take their cut, and now the thing is off and running. But I think it's really important to kind of know your platform, know the dynamics of it, and figure out the right way to make sure that those two sides kind of efficiently meet each other. And you're seeing this a lot more in marketplaces now. So if you think back to what I call marketplaces 1.0 is like eBay, Craigslist, right? Their job is like create a website and people just show up on both sides. They don't get into the transaction at all. And that can mean you get a bad experience. That can mean you get ripped off. That can mean the goods aren't, of the same quality you thought, or the money, you send money, you never get anything back, whatever. Now you're seeing this like 2.0 marketplaces, which look at like Uber, TaskRabbit, HomeJoy, kind of Postmates, where they're like moving a little further up the stack. So they're going to train the people on one side. They're going to kind of guarantee a certain level of service. They'll take the actual credit card and transaction for you. And so they get more value out of it. They actually capture more of the money in that process, but they guarantee a better result. It just takes a lot more work to try, Uber now has to try and manage the drivers and train them and deal with them being gripey, whereas theoretically Uber could be a Craigslist thing, right? Like it could be someone, kind of used to work in ride sharing. Someone goes onto the website and says, hey, I need a ride from Palo Alto to the city on Friday, and someone would say, okay, I can go drive there for you, but it's super inefficient, right? And so the more of the platform you can kind of build up and support, it makes that connection a lot more efficient.
With your new hat, do you have any thoughts on fundraising for hardware right now?
Yes. Just in fun, so it's been really interesting switching from operating to venture side. Tons to learn. It's a whole new muscle. One of the things one of the things I've seen a bunch, not just in hardware, but people start building something they think is kind of cool without knowing why they're building it yet. And I think you especially see it in hardware because it's this new thing and it's like super fun and things that couldn't be built before are suddenly being built. But with all these things, you have to ask why. And so I see a lot of decks starting with like, well, here's the thing we've built and here's why it's cool. Here's the features on it. Here's the team and like, here's kind of the early growth and we're raising $10 million. And you're like, well, why, right? Like anyone can get an early adopter market. That part can happen. You can see something grow to 1 million or 2 million users, maybe at least in software, probably harder in hardware, pretty quickly, and then never see the 3 millionth or 4th millionth user. And I think what you have to keep going back to is this like concept of motivation and why, and start with like, what is the problem in the world you're solving? And if you can't articulate that incredibly well, and then understand the size of that even now and over time, that's like the fundamental thing you have to figure out. And if I can't understand that in the deck and I can't understand that in the pitch of what someone's saying, and they can't articulate it that well, that concerns me about investing in it, because you're going to have to keep coming back to solving this product. The first thing you build is probably not going to be the right thing. And you got to kind of know where you're pointed in the universe to know that like, okay, well that first one didn't work out, but I know that problem exists, and I know that I learned from this one. I'm going to scrap part of that thing. I'm going to rebuild around the core that worked, but I'm still going to go solve that thing because I know the audience and I know what motivates them. And so I think it's really important sometimes to go back and keep thinking that through, like put it up on the wall, like know who your user is, know what they're dealing with every day, and keep coming back to that, because you can start getting like so nose down, like, oh, if we just add that other feature, that'd be really cool. And you're like, well, that was built for 2% of our audience cares about that feature. And now we just wasted 3 or 4 weeks and a bunch of our money, and now our thing costs more, and the rest of the users aren't going to get value out of it. So really be thinking through like what's the minimum viable thing you can build that has the most impact in a specific space that has a need. Hardware in general, trying to think of other stuff. So Redpoint has done hardware stuff in the past. We did Sonos, we've recently done Coin. Coin was a really interesting one because he was a software engineer before and just decided he wanted this thing to exist in the world and taught himself how to manufacture it on his own. So the original prototypes are this like kind of piece of card with just tons of wires off of it, and he was figuring out it's awesome. I love seeing that, because it's like someone found a passion what they want to do, and they just went so deep in learning how to go build that thing that they figured out, instead of having to like just get up a team around them, because you want that depth of knowledge, especially from a founder in a certain space. That was really cool. So I think people are investing in hardware. You definitely you got to be thinking through some of the macro stuff, and you guys would know this better than me, so it's kind of uneducated on my side. But a lot of the stuff I get fearful of is I see like Bluetooth Low Energy is a good one. So I think of that as a really interesting and fundamental new space. To have anything pushed onto 400 million phones is just like, as software, is a really like, that's a huge change. Okay, so now what does that mean for unlocking in the ecosystem? Well, it can mean beacons, but you saw a bunch of companies up building beacons, and I'm like, and those things are just gonna be like turned over to China. China's gonna make them for like, a penny on your dollar. Like that's not a business over time. And if you think you're making a business on just that, that's really scary. But so maybe you start with that, but that's the then leg into building the software that then goes and makes sense of all of it. And maybe that still is something you build out and you make those uniquely better than China. I don't know, but like I see a lot of pitches coming in where they get first into the market, but you got to know the dynamics of the global manufacturing space and where some of the like low end stuff without a lot of intelligence in them can get shipped off really easily and made really cheaply. And then if you can also assume that, you're like, okay, well, if they're going to be everywhere, then what's the next level service that you're going to need in there? It's probably analytics on top of it, or it's probably services to make that more usable for brands, whatever it is, right? And be thinking through that kind of next level, because I think it's so early in the hardware thing and it's exciting to watch. And we'll start to see how these things kind of meter out, but be thinking one step ahead, because I think it'll be, when you're in the Wild West of new space, you got to be thinking through how the big plates are going to move.
Is that a mindset of hardware that this can be copied and your position is less tenable? Is that a...
No, I don't think it's of all hardware. We've seen some really unique stuff. So we did the coin investment for sure. That could be done somewhere else, but they're building a brand around it. They do have IP. Like, it's possible. I think you just gotta know where in that spectrum you sit of like the complexity of things and how much of a brand you're going to have and how much does this thing just need. So the Bluetooth beacons, those need to exist everywhere, right? Like, in order for that whole ecosystem to work, those things have to be super low cost. And if you're going to try and fight China on like low cost, you're screwed. It's like trying to fight Amazon on like low cost e-commerce. You're not going to win. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I don't think it's you might get that view at some venture firms and with some partners. I think there is still some intrepidation around hardware and just trying to figure it out because people aren't educated on it yet. But I think people understand the opportunity. There's enough good examples out there that you at least have stuff to point to.
So what do you think about the issue or the concept of usability on hardware? So it's not the development of a beacon or the new chips or whatever, but the fact that so much of this hardware is designed for EEs to work with, and we have to have some low-level understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Yet there's so many potential applied uses of this technology for people in other disciplines to use, but can't access it unless they have an EE on their team or they themselves have an EE.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of products and applications which start to look at the user-centered part of working with these technologies, do you think there's any bit there?
Maybe explain the question a little more. So you're saying that like building of hardware is inaccessible because it has such a specific requirement in an E person, and not many teams have.
It requires specific skills. So
Yep.
Even if you have the basic skills, it still requires specific skills,
Yep.
which are rare.
Yep.
We're surrounded by them in the larger world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was true of iOS developers for a long time, right? And anything that starts to grow, like you'll see more people. And I think there's enough contract manufacturing out there. You have small labs. Like it seems to be becoming a lot more distributed and accessible than it was even probably 2 years ago. You guys, again, will know this much better than I, but my kind of lay perception of it is becoming way more accessible. And someone like Kanishk at Coin, who was a software engineer, had no E background, was able to kind of figure it out and prototype something, and then they're getting contract manufacturers to do the rest of it. So I had a friend who was doing cables for a while, and he was a total software guy, and he was working on HDMI cables. Flew to China and like met with some teams over there. They helped him spec it out, and he built a good business on it for a while. So I think the tools are there. We're lucky. We're also in a great place we have good access to Asia, and there's enough great talent here and enough kind of great places to start working on it. So it seems like it's spreading. But
I guess my question is not necessarily looking at the manufacturing level of it, but the prototyping level of it. So, if you look at folks who might be coming from design or architecture or non-computational backgrounds who might want to be working with these tools. So I'm wondering, what your perspective is on looking at products that bring these tools to the level where people like that.
Making it more accessible to the broader. I mean, in general, it's always a good investment if you think a tool is valuable and someone produces technology that makes a previously inaccessible, piece of technology or value more accessible. That's a great thing, right? Over time, mobile phones were a great example of that. So I think that there's a business there. You just got to figure out how big the audience of people is that need access to it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.